Chapter 9. Not much farther, Carolyn said, breathing hard as her vision faded in and out. Every step she took now rattled the shrapnel buried in her stomach. But they were only a few blocks away from the house, and she'd be able to rest once they were inside, and she knew Eric was safe. "Mom?" Eric asked her, his voice heavy with concern. "Are you all right?" He'd adapted to the state of the city rather quickly and was able to move with her, engage in conversation again, and block out the horrors that surrounded them at every street corner. And there were a great many horrors to put out of mind. Everywhere they'd gone, through the haze and smoke, they encountered burning bodies, dying, screaming people on the street, and looters who rifled through the burned-out husks of stores and homes. Some looked as though they might approach the two of them, but Carolyn quickly lifted her gun and showed the thugs she wasn't a woman to be messed with. Some of them seemed to weigh their odds, but none of them tried her. There were far more victims in the city who were unarmed and helpless. These bottom feeders didn't want to take the chance of rising up against someone who could actually defend themselves. "I'm fine," she said back through clenched teeth. Though her boy was much smarter than that, and he likely knew she was hurting. Of course, there was no way he could know the severity of her wound. She kept her face void of agony. The only thing giving away her discomfort was her slowing gait and the sweat covering her face. "Mom, you don't look fine," Eric insisted, coming up beside her and laying a soft, gentle hand against her arm. Carolyn jerked away from his touch, more forcefully than she'd intended. It almost felt as though her son would be able to tell how much pain she was in by just laying a hand on her skin. Of course, that was ridiculous, but Carolyn's mind was starting to reel, and she was losing touch with reality. "We're almost there," she breathed to her son, pointing with the gun at the road ahead. "3 more blocks and we're home." "Ma, just tell me what's wrong," he said, his tone stern and stubborn, just like his daddy. "I'm fine, baby," she said, breathing heavily as she eyed the road before them. "We can stop when we're home. We're too close now to—" Carolyn swallowed her words as the world started to rapidly spin around her. She swayed to and fro and could only vaguely hear Eric calling out to her. His voice sounded as though it were coming to her from underwater. As the planet tilted at a sharp angle, Carolyn lost her balance and felt her legs crumble underneath her. She was too tired to move, and too tired to even feel the impact of the sidewalk against her hip as she landed. "Ma!" Eric cried out as he crouched beside her. "Ma, what's wrong? What can I do?" His hands hovered just over her, as though he were suddenly afraid that touching her would cause her even greater discomfort. Carolyn's hands shook and instinctively centered themselves around her abdomen, as if trying to ward off any potential harm from her most vulnerable area. "Your stomach?" Eric asked, observing her movements. "Is there something wrong with your stomach?" She couldn't answer him now. Her eyes were rolling back as the sun beat down on her aching body. She was powerless to stop him as he grabbed onto the bottom of her shirt and lifted it. She could hear him gasp in alarm as he saw the shrapnel sticking out of her flesh. Eric reeled to the sight of the foreign object poking its way out of his mother's stomach. His mind raced, and his breathing became fast and ragged. He had no idea how serious of a wound it was. He immediately reached out for it, but Carolyn's fingers wrapped around his to stop him. "No," she insisted, pushing back on him with what minimal strength she still had. "Blood." Eric got the message instantly. The wound was bleeding around the shrapnel right now, but if he pulled it out, there would likely be a fountain of blood that could spell doom for his beloved mother. "Ma, what should I do?" he asked her. She always had the answers. She and his father had been unshakable pillars of strength in his life while living in a world that made sense and felt safe. But now, that world had changed, maybe forever, and his parents were mortal beings made of flesh and blood and bone. That flesh could be torn, that blood could be spilled, and those bones could be broken. His parents could die, leaving him alone in this crazy world to fend for himself. Then what would he do? Could he survive? He'd been trained, of course. His father had seen to that personally. But shooting targets and navigating through the woods was one thing. Facing the apocalypse was something else entirely. "Ma, please talk to me," Eric said, desperate for her to say something, anything that would reassure him. But there was only silence. Carolyn's eyes were still open, still moving, but she seemed unable to focus on anything save for the pain. "Damn it," Eric said, looking down through the smoke-induced fog in the direction his mother had been pointing. He knew their apartment was close. She'd said it was only about 3 blocks from here, and he knew the way. Carolyn had protected him as they had made the journey through these war-torn streets. With a lump in his throat, Eric realized it was now time for him to man up and be there to protect his mother for this final sprint of the trip. "Come on, Ma," he called down to her, taking her by the arm and gingerly helping her into a seated position. She reached up and laid her arm over his shoulders, and he prepared to lift her up. Then he spotted something lying on the ground beside her. Her gun. Eric had handled literally hundreds of firearms throughout his life. He was well trained in their use. But the idea of picking one up in the middle of a war zone made his entire body freeze with dread. This wasn't hunting or target practice. This was real honest-to-God combat. He could come up against a real-life human who wanted to end his life. And the only thing standing between his continued existence and oblivion would be the gun in his hand. His fingers shook, just inches away from the handle. He felt as though if he reached out and took it, everything would change forever. It would be an admission on his part that this horror show he faced in the streets of a city he loved was real. And he was a combatant, involved in the most heinous attack ever committed on American soil. But then he looked down at his mother, who desperately clung to him. She was helpless now, and would be easy prey for any of the low-life thugs pillaging the city around them. She needed to be defended, and he was the only one around with the strength and the training to keep her safe. He reached down and placed his palm around the gun's handle, wrapping his hand around it and lifting it as he stood with his mother. For some reason, Eric had thought the act of picking up the weapon might somehow empower him, like some magical sword in a fantasy story. But he felt no different, and was even more scared now than he'd been just a few moments ago. "All right, Ma," he said to his mother, who leaned heavily against him. "We gotta move now." Eric took a labored step and was relieved when Carolyn's feet started to move. He wasn't going to have to carry her or drag her along the sidewalk, but it seemed as though he was going to have to support her weight and guide her as she tried to soldier through the unfathomable pain. They made it a block and a half, with no major issues. Once in a while, Eric would have to alter their course slightly as they came upon bodies or fleeing civilians. Eric gave them a wide berth, unwilling to get too close. He was hoping that no one would approach and held the gun at waist height, hoping it would scare off any interested parties. "Whoa, kid," someone said off to the right. Eric turned to see 4 men walk through the smoke toward them. "Your old lady there looks like she could use some help." "She's fine," Eric said, taking a step back and trying to shield his mother with his body. "She doesn't look fine," the man said, taking another step toward them. How about we help you carry her, and in return you give us those backpacks? Sounds like a fair deal? No deal, Eric said, his voice shaking with fear as those large, muscled men continued to approach. Stay back. Now that's no way to talk to people trying to lend a helping hand, the man said, only a few feet away now. You need to learn some manners. For that, I think we're just going to take those bags and you can keep carrying the broad yourself. Back off, Eric screamed, holding up the gun and pointing it at the man. The barrel shook with the anxiety that quaked through his entire arm. He'd never pointed a gun at a human being before, and the action turned his stomach. But before he could even think of pulling the trigger, the man swung out, slamming his arm into Eric's wrist, knocking the gun from his grip. He then gave Eric a hard shove, sending both Eric and Carolyn down to the ground in a heap. Eric felt disoriented for a moment, but then he could see the man who shoved him looking for the weapon. He realized he needed to act immediately, and all of his fear was suddenly pushed to the side by a surge of adrenaline. He ran at the man, erupting from the ground and staying low in a crouch. He slammed into his midsection shoulder first and drove all of his weight into this stranger, tackling him like an expert defensive lineman. While Eric was a quarterback, he'd picked up a few things during drills. The man grunted in surprise as the muscular teen smacked against him, taking him down to the ground. Eric landed on top of his opponent and formed a tight fist. He slammed that fist down into the side of the man's head, but before he could do it again, two of his comrades grabbed him by the arms and wrenched him off. Jesus, the last man standing said, helping the first man off the ground. He sacked your ass, Larry. Shut the fuck up, Steve, Larry spat. Now I'm mad. He approached Eric, who struggled against the two men holding him. Eric kicked out at Larry and struck him hard in the chest. This drove the older man back as Steve advanced. Eric attempted to kick him as well, but Steve simply caught him by the leg and swung out with a meaty fist to punch Eric square in the abdomen. Eric felt all the air leave his lungs as he doubled over in pain. The two men holding him threw him down on the ground as Larry approached from the side. The four of them started to kick at Eric, striking him in the side, legs, arms, and even his head as he tried desperately to cover up. Get the bag, Larry screamed, fumbling with Eric's backpack. Eric fought back, trying to kick up at him, but he was quickly overwhelmed by the four grown men who continued kicking at any exposed area of his body. Got it, Larry cried out in triumph as he wrenched the bag from Eric's back. He took a step back, holding it up like a trophy, when a sudden, blaring gunshot sounded. Eric watched as Larry's chest sprayed blood. His eyes opened in shock as another shot slammed into his shoulder. He dropped the bag as he fell to the ground, limp and lifeless. Eric and his remaining three assailants turned to see Carolyn, seated against the brick wall of the nearby building, holding the gun aloft as she took aim once more. She fired again, this time catching Steve in the stomach. He doubled over, howling in pain, as she opened fire once more, hitting him in the forehead. As he fell dead, the remaining two men who had held Eric by the arms turned and ran, desperate to escape before they joined their friends in death. Holy shit, Eric breathed, looking over at his mother, her blood-stained face grim with strength and determination. She still held the gun, the barrel shaking with the incredible strain she used to keep it there. Then her arm went limp, dropping it to the ground. The gun clinked onto the pavement as Eric ran toward his mother and crouched in front of her. Ma, he asked, brushing some of her blonde hair off of her face and holding her pale, blood-splotched cheek in the palm of his hand. "Ma, are you all right?" For a moment, Carolyn didn't move, and Eric's heart beat with a frenzied level of panic. But then she groaned in pain, her eyes fluttering open and focusing on her son's face. I'm fine," she breathed. If Eric's face hadn't been so close to hers, he would have never heard her whispered assurance. We need to keep going." Eric nodded to her, moving to his mother's side to help her stand. "Wait," Carolyn breathed, her hand crawling along the pavement toward the discarded gun. Eric watched as her shaking fingers closed around it. "You need to take it." Eric started to protest, but his mother's other hand came up to hold his chin with her thumb and forefinger. She ensured he was looking right into her serious eyes. "You can do this," she said, her quiet assurance sending a wave of uncertainty through Eric's body. He looked back over at the two men who lay dying in the street. His mother had coldly executed them to save his life. He wondered if he would have that same level of bravery and drive when push came to shove. He'd tried and failed once already. He could have stopped those men before they'd gotten their hands on him, but he was weak, and in his hesitation, he had put his mother in harm's way. She'd shown more bravery than him while suffering from a gut wound. She could barely stand, but she had protected him. And here he was, completely healthy and capable, and he'd been worse than helpless. He couldn't let that happen again. He wouldn't. He laid his hand against his mother's, which still sat on the handle of the gun. He gently moved her hand off the weapon and set it on her lap. Then he reached down and gripped the gun, pulling it up with determination. He promised himself that he wouldn't fail a second time. Once the weapon was in his hand, Eric worked on pulling his mother up from the sidewalk. She groaned in pain as they stood together, but she was clearly doing her best to seal that agonized noise behind clenched lips. "You all right?" Eric asked, steadying his balance with his mother's weight against him. She simply nodded and grunted in the affirmative, and Eric knew he had to get her to safety immediately. "All right, I got you, Ma." They continued slowly down the street, the smoke beginning to clear, until Eric could actually see the vague outline of their apartment building in front of them. They were so close now, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in their way. There were people on the street once more, alive and wandering. Every one of them represented some unknown threat. Even those who appeared harmless or potentially helpful could in some way threaten their safety. Eric wasn't taking any chances this time. He raised the gun and pointed it forward, swinging it to point at every person he saw. When they saw him train his weapon on them, many fled. Others fell to the ground and huddled in the fetal position. There was a part of Eric's mind that felt sorry for these people, that wanted to apologize and assure them that he meant no harm. But every time those weak feelings bubbled to the surface, the memory of those horrible men just a block or two away hardened his heart. He wasn't actually killing anyone. He was just letting them know he and his mother were not to be trifled with. The gun allowed Eric to clear a path through the onlookers and wanderers as their home grew larger and larger before him. As the part of him that felt guilt for his treatment of these seemingly innocent men and women on the street shrank away, it was replaced by something else. It felt good to watch as people showed him deference and respect. Sure, the respect they showed was for the gun and not him, but for the first time in his young life, Eric felt powerful. He was a good-looking, popular boy who held some sway at school, and for a while, that had felt like power. As a child, he'd grown up on a farm that his parents owned around those in their employ. That, too, had felt like power at the time. But this was something else entirely. This was godly power. The rush of inspiring fear in others. He knew this was something he should hate, something he should reject and be disgusted by. But it felt good to feel powerful, truly powerful, for the first time in his life. It was easy for Eric to see how someone could become addicted to this feeling. Perhaps that was why people delved into lives of crime and intimidation. Was this the feeling of purpose and power that drove people to bully and abuse one another? Eric instantly realized that whatever this was, whatever dragon it represented that coiled around his heart, it wasn't for him. That wasn't how he operated, and it wasn't how his parents had raised him. His father was the most skilled and capable man Eric had ever known, and he'd never resorted to intimidation or power plays to get what he wanted out of life. His mother was a gentle and caring soul who knew how to defend herself. She wielded this kind of power responsibly. Eric was going to live by their example. He would never use this kind of power to prey on people, to forcibly take what he wanted. Instead, he would use it to protect himself and those he cared about, to defend what he needed out of life. "We're here," he breathed to his mother, as this epiphany raced through his head. She nodded against his shoulders and opened her eyes to look at the door to their building. The glass surface of the door had been shattered, likely from the explosions. All of the windows of the pharmacy that sat at the base of the building were equally decimated. Eric stepped over the broken glass, pulling his mother along with him. "It's time for the stairs, Ma," he said to her, as they paused through the lobby. "Can you make it?" She nodded weakly, but Eric knew climbing 25 flights of stairs would be a huge challenge for his wounded mother. But at the top of those steps sat their apartment, filled with supplies, with a medical kit that would enable her to treat that wound. It was possible his father was even up there waiting for them. "I need you to trust me here," Eric said to his mother. And before she could question him, he swept her up in his arms, holding her under the shoulders and knees. She groaned in pain at the sudden upward movement, but soon settled against him. Eric took a deep breath and started the climb. Nearly an hour later, an exhausted and sweating Eric stumbled out of the stairwell, holding his mother in his aching arms. They finally reached the door to their apartment, and Eric looked around the hallway for any sign of danger. The hallway, however, looked the same as always, with the exception of the dark shadows that blanketed it. The familiarity of the space was almost unnerving for Eric. It was a dose of normalcy, but with enough change mixed in to make the place feel slightly alien. Eric set his mother down beside the door and fumbled in his backpack for the keys. He pulled them out and unlocked the door, flinging it open and bracing himself, as if expecting it to be filled to the brim with terrorists planting bombs. But there was nothing out of the ordinary, save for lack of electricity and a few broken windows. "We're home, Ma," he said, the relief palpable in his voice. Carolyn grunted in response, and Eric helped her to her feet once more. They stumbled together into the apartment, and Eric kicked the door closed behind them. He maneuvered his mother over to the couch and gently laid her down, kneeling beside her and placing a hand on her clammy forehead. "I'll get your kit," he said, practically falling over himself as he ran to the hallway closet to retrieve his mother's first aid kit. He set it down next to her, and Carolyn sat up at an angle. "Good," she said, reaching out to grab it. "Just tell me what you need and I'll help however I can," Eric said, ready to assist in whatever way she needed. Over the next 20 minutes, Eric watched as his mother removed the shrapnel from her own stomach, dealing with incredible pain as blood started to flow. He then helped her control the bleeding, clean the wound, and sew it back up with a sterile needle. "We did it," he exclaimed, suddenly looking around the darkened apartment as if the next leg of their journey was going to suddenly make itself known to him. "What do we do now?" "We wait for your father, and get ready to move," she replied, taking a deep breath and settling back down onto the couch. "You really think he's coming?" Eric asked, as the sounds of gunfire and fresh explosions wafted in through the broken windows. "Oh, I know he is," Carolyn said, gingerly laying her hands on her stitched-up stomach. "You just start getting everything ready to move out, so that when he does get here, we're good to go." Eric nodded to his mother and moved about the apartment, grabbing the bug-out bags they had prepared in the event of an evacuation-level event like this from the closet. As he gathered rations and supplies, Eric could hear the sounds of conflict escalating outside. He was glad they were so high up and only hoped the fighting remained on the street and out of their vicinity for the time being. "All right, Ma," Eric said, coming back to his mother to check on her bandages. "I've got everything ready to go. We can move out as soon as you feel up to it." "We're waiting for your father," Carolyn said. "He'll be here." "But how long are we going to sit around and wait?" he asked. He had faith in his father and had no doubt that he was trying to make his way to them. But what if he failed? What if he'd been caught in an explosion or overrun by looters? Were they supposed to just wait here forever for help that might never arrive? "We'll wait another day," Carolyn said, clearly noting the conflict in Eric's eyes. "If he's not here by then, we'll move out on our own, all right?" Before Eric could answer, a disturbance in the hallway drew his attention. He could hear voices out there, loud and urgent, along with the sound of heavy-booted footsteps and gunshots. He immediately shot up and grabbed his mother's gun off the coffee table. The voices stopped outside the door to the apartment, and Eric could feel his chest tightening with anxiety. Suddenly, something large slammed into the door, nearly knocking it off its hinges. "Eric, wait," Carolyn said, holding out a hand. But the object slammed against the door once more, and Eric raised the gun, pointing it straight ahead, ready to combat whatever was trying to break into their home. He wasn't going to freeze up. Not again. The huge object slammed against the door once more, breaking the lock and splintering the massive entryway. Panicking as he saw the shards of door explode into the apartment, Eric pulled the trigger. Chapter 10. "Shit, there it is," Joe said, putting his hands on his hips and looking up at the massive apartment building that loomed ahead of them, just a few blocks off. The smoke that filled the air had parted enough to give them a hazy view of their ultimate destination, and while relieved to see it, Sam felt as though it was a foreboding visual. "Yeah," he replied, rolling his shoulders and gripping his rifle with renewed intensity. "What's wrong?" Joe asked. "I just feel like getting there ain't gonna be easy," Sam replied through gritted teeth. "What makes you say that?" Joe asked him with a raised eyebrow. "We're basically home free. We made it this far and only ran into trouble one time." "Just a feeling I'm getting," Sam replied, unable to shake the horrible dread that pushed on his psyche. "This isn't a video game," Joe said with a scoff and a pat on the back. "There's not some final boss waiting for us at the top of the tower. The only thing waiting for us up there is your family, brother." "I hope so," Sam said, unable to keep the dread from his voice. "Come on," Joe said, with a knowing smirk twisting his face. "The horn of Helm Hammerhand shall sound in the deep, one last time." Sam laughed in spite of himself. "No Lord of the Rings, you nerd. We have to focus," he said. "Let this be the hour that we draw swords together," Joe said, his smile only growing as he laid a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Enough," Sam said with a chuckle, knocking Joe's hand off him. "Now for wrath," Joe said, as they started to walk toward the building. And Sam felt the weight of the world ease its crushing pressure from his shoulders. "Now for ruin in the Red Dawn." Sam fully laughed at this, allowing his fears to dissipate, if only for a moment. That moment seemed to stretch for an eternity to Sam, as though somewhere deep down, he knew it was one of the last moments of carefree joy he'd have for a long time. Ahead of them, a series of silhouetted figures moved through the smoke, coming from both sides of the street to block their path. Joe and Sam stopped in their tracks, the jovial laughter they'd been experiencing dying in their throats. Sam held his rifle, and Joe drew his from its place along his back. Sam's entire body tensed, a pit forming in his stomach. "Hope you enjoyed that laugh, cabron," a voice said from behind them, that sent coursing waves of chilling dread throughout Sam's extremities. It was a voice he knew well, one he could never forget. It was a taunting cadence he heard every night as he laid his head down for sleep. "It's gonna be your last." Sam slowly turned to see even more figures moving through the smoke behind them, barring them into the city block on which they stood. Stepping through the haze came a tall, stocky figure with a shorn scalp. The man was smiling, and the gleam of the signature grill covering his teeth shone like a shimmering beacon. It reminded Sam of the bioluminescent bulb on the head of a predatory sea creature, meant to draw in unsuspecting prey. But that face's most terrifying feature had already been the eyes, or eye as it was now. That eye was cold and dead, like that of a doll or a shark. It was the telltale eye of a true sociopath who felt nothing for those he preyed upon. Sam had always described them as the eyes of a true monster, one who cared nothing for who and what it had destroyed to carve its way into the world. It was the eye of a predator, the eye of a creature of hell, the single remaining eye of Julio Roja. "Shit," Sam muttered under his breath, and Joe looked over at him in question. "Roja," Sam growled, both to acknowledge his old enemy and fill Joe in on who exactly was standing in front of them. "Shit," Joe growled in response. "That's him? The guy who shot out your knee?" "That's him," Sam responded, his eyes never leaving the single eye of Roja as they locked into one another across the desolate street. "Dear, I thought I'd never see you again, amigo," Roja said, sauntering out in front of his men, who all stood at the ready. He was confident now, completely self-assured and knowing there was nothing Sam could do against him before he was violently gunned down. "But here you are, like the universe brought you back to my doorstep as a gift." "The universe did nothing," Sam responded, his voice carrying over the empty street. "And you're nothing more than a momentary diversion, you piece of shit." As he spoke to the man who had ended his career, a sudden flash of pain burned across his injured knee. Sam knew there was nothing about Julio's presence that could physically harm him, but the psychosomatic reaction was noted and felt. "Momentary diversion," Roja laughed, and many of his men laughed along with him. "The balls on this man, eh?" He gestured towards Sam with both arms, as if proving a point to his men. "I told you all, balls the size of grapefruits. They're going to look great mounted on my wall." "All right, back down, asshole," Joe said, taking a small step forward to put himself between his friend and the murderous psychopath who had sworn to kill him. "Who are you, big man?" Julio asked, one eyebrow raised as he looked Joe up and down. "His bodyguard?" "This man doesn't need a bodyguard," Joe responded, his face harder than granite as he stared down the dangerous drug lord. "The only one who needs protection right now is you." Roja laughed, and the cackle caught on until his men on either side of Sam and Joe were joining in, as though Joe had just told the ultimate joke. Man, you're big, but you don't got a lot going on upstairs, do you, amigo? Julio said, gesturing around him. We got you surrounded. You're 2 men and we're 24. If I were you, I'd start begging for my life. If you were me? Joe asked. Yeah, that tracks. But thankfully, I'm not a little bitch coward like you. The entire street fell deathly silent. Sam swore he could see Julio's men take a collective step back and away from their leader as the waves of red-hot rage that so easily defined this man were suddenly coursing through the area. Bitch coward? Julio asked, his voice and face dropping sharply. He seemed to reach a space beyond rage, where instead of fuming and turning red, his face came all the way back around to calm. You're calling me a bitch coward. Most men would have withered in the wake of such palpable rage from a known murderer and crime lord. But Joe wasn't most men. Faced with the fearsome sight of the most deadly man Sam had ever known, smoldering in white-hot anger, Joe actually smirked. What are you, deaf on top of stupid? Joe said. Only a little bitch coward brings a posse to a fight like this. What's wrong? Afraid my friend here will take your other eye? Maybe your ear this time. Or maybe he'll just finish what he started a long time ago and put your pathetic bitch ass in the ground. Julio's nostrils flared, and even Sam was starting to get worried. Julio Roja was known for his intense temper. Gang wars had been started on the streets due to the volatile nature of this man's fragile ego. He was one of those men who oozed machismo and pride, and any perceived slight to either of those traits was met with explosive anger, and almost always with violence. Julio extended a shaking arm toward Joe and pointed with one long, thick finger. You just signed your death note, he said, his voice a low growl that reminded Sam of a shovel scraping against gravel. The two of you are gonna die slowly, painfully, until you're begging me for it to end. Julio took a step toward them, as though planning on fighting them himself. One of his men dashed forward to stop him, laying a hand on his shoulder. Boss, wait, the man cried out in fear, sensing Joe might be able to take the drug lord out in a one-on-one fight. The moment the man's hand made contact with Julio's shoulder, he screamed in rage and turned, slamming his fist into the side of the man's face. The unfortunate cartel member fell back immediately, dropping his rifle to the ground. The entire group of Julio's men behind them recoiled, knowing they could be next. Sam turned to look at the cartel soldiers on the other side of the street, and they, too, had lowered their weapons and were watching in horrified awe. You don't tell me to wait, Julio screamed as he descended on the man and started beating him mercilessly. You don't fucking tell me shit. Now, Joe whispered to Sam, grabbing his friend by the arm and taking off toward the alleyway on the far side of the street. Hey, one of the cartel soldiers shouted, drawing attention of his comrades away from the wild beating and toward their fleeing quarry. The sudden cry seemed to snap Julio out of his rage-fueled stupor, and he looked up to see Sam and Joe making their escape. Open fire, you idiots, he called out, and instantly the air was filled with whizzing bullets. Thankfully, there were a number of disabled cars on the road that Joe and Sam were able to use for cover, crouching behind them as they dashed from vehicle to vehicle. The alley, Sam called out over his shoulder, just barely audible over the sound of gunfire. Right behind you, Joe said, which reassured Sam more than he thought the big man would ever truly know. They burst out from their temporary cover and ran into the alley, though the sound of pursuit could be heard just a moment or two behind them. Julio's screams were so loud and so full of earth-cracking rage that they could be heard over the blaring weapons. "Get them!" he screamed, hysterical and infuriated at how the tables had turned so quickly on them. Sam heard Joe skid to a halt behind him and looked back to see his friend, kneeling on the ground, slipping the pack off his back and rifling through it. "What are you doing?" Sam called out, running over to Joe and laying a hand on his shoulder. "Taking care of business," Joe replied. Pulling several grenades out of the bag, he handed 4 of them to Sam. And no more words were needed between them. Sam started to pull the pins out of his explosives and lobbed them toward the entrance to the alleyway, where the cartel soldiers would be at any second. Joe followed suit, and as soon as the last grenade left their hands, the 2 of them took off running. "There they are!" one of the cartel soldiers yelled. They opened fire once more as they pursued, but they were shooting while moving, and that threw off their aim. A second later, the sounds of many grenades all going off together filled the alleyway. The concussive force of the conjoined explosions pressed against Sam's back as he ran, and he could hear the terrified, pained shrieks of the cartel soldiers behind them. "That'll thin out the herd a bit," Joe said with a short laugh. As they burst free of the alley, the 2 of them continued to weave through the various cars stopped in the road to throw off the aim of their pursuers, should any of them manage to follow. "Think we got Roja?" Sam asked, not daring to glance back for fear it would slow him down too much. "I don't know if we're that lucky," Joe responded with a shake of his head. "But we should probably take the scenic route the rest of the way to throw these fuckers off." Sam found himself incredibly thankful for Joe's presence, not for the first time. He had to admit to himself as they worked their way through block after block that he'd been overcome with emotion upon seeing Roja again. If it hadn't been for Joe and his quick thinking, he would have died there in the street, leaving Carolyn and Eric to face this horrifying new world alone. He owed his life to Joe. And more importantly, he owed the lives of his family to him. "Hey," Sam said to Joe, as they stopped to catch their breath, only a block away from the apartment building. He looked back to see if there was any sign of pursuit, but thankfully they seemed to have given Roja the slip. "What's up?" Joe asked, leaning his broad back against a brick wall and stretching his legs. "I just want to say thanks," Sam said, looking his friend in the eye. "You really saved my ass back there. That was some quick thinking." Occasionally I can think quick," Joe said with a shrug. "I remember what you said about that piece of shit's anger issues. So I figured creating a little chaos was our best way out of that situation." "Well, you were right," Sam said with a deep sigh. "You got us out of there, and now the finish line is in sight again. I gotta hand it to you, Joseph. You're a hell of a soldier." "You're no slouch yourself, old man," Joe responded with a chuckle. He looked down at Sam's knee. "How's the wheel holding up?" "Not bad," Sam said, engaging the joint a bit and wincing as he did. "A little tight, but nowhere near as bad as I was expecting." "Well, then, we have a lot to celebrate," Joe replied, pointing down toward the building. "And we'll be able to celebrate properly once we have Carolyn and Eric and are on our way out of this hellhole." "I couldn't agree more," Sam said, deciding that he'd rested enough. Together, the 2 friends walked toward their ultimate destination, a light feeling of relief in their hearts as the building sat impossibly tall and mostly untouched right before them. "Home free," Joe said, patting his friend on the shoulder. "I just hope they're there," Sam replied, looking up at the building with a foreboding feeling gnawing at his gut. "I'm afraid of what we're going to find." "We're going to find your wife and son," Joe said loudly, his voice filling the street with his triumphant cry. They're going to be alive and in one piece and waiting for us to bring them the fuck home." "Yeah, you're right," Sam said with a shrug. "I don't know what I was thinking." "I do," a voice called out from behind them. Sam felt his stomach drop as he and Joe turned to see Julio Rojas standing behind them, a group of nearly 40 cartel soldiers flanking him as they spread out around the street. "You thought you were safe, but you were wrong." Chapter 11. This wasn't good. Sam cursed silently in his mind over and over again. Roja was here. He'd followed him to this place. He led the most dangerous man he'd ever known right to his wife and son. And he'd arrived with far more soldiers than he had with him on the street. "Shit," Joe murmured, giving voice to Sam's thoughts. "Oh, what's wrong, big man?" Rojas said with a jeer. "Not feeling so hot anymore, eh? Who's the bitch now?" "Still you," Joe responded, keeping his cool even in this dire situation. That was more than Sam could do. Facing down Roja was difficult enough for him as it was. But now, knowing he had led this man right to Carolyn and Eric, filled him with an overwhelming sense of self-hatred and fear that any words he might have offered died in his throat long before ever reaching his mouth. Roja's eyes darkened, but Joe's words didn't push him into that pit of anger once more. He'd learned from before, and Sam knew Roja was not one to make the same mistake twice. It was what made him so formidable. It was what kept him in power for all of these years. "Big talk coming from a big corpse," Rojas said to Joe, before his eyes moved toward Sam with a cruel joy sparkling across them. "And you, Shields, did I hear you right? Your wife and son are in there. Well, this day just keeps getting better and better. The only thing better than killing you is killing your family in front of you." Sam saw red as soon as the words left Julio's mouth. Instead of responding, he drew his twin handguns with the speed and dexterity of an Old West action hero. He fired at Roja, but the drug lord was quick. He jumped to the side and hit the pavement as his soldiers sprang into action. As soon as their guns rose, Joe slammed into Sam's side, tackling him to the ground behind a mid-sized sedan. As the powerful rounds fired off from the automatic rifles pelted against the exterior of the vehicle. Broken glass rained down on them as Joe covered Sam with his body, shielding him from harm. "Nice plan," Joe scoffed right into Sam's ear. "Maybe a little warning next time, yeah?" Sam didn't respond. He couldn't. They were pinned down and trapped now, and it was all his fault. The cartel members had covered their tracks well. Both he and Joe had been so preoccupied with their journey's end that they hadn't noticed Roja tailing them. And now they couldn't run. They couldn't hide. If they somehow managed to slip away, Roja would simply tear the apartment building apart, looking for Carolyn and Eric. If they were in there, they were as good as dead. Sam pushed Joe off of him and nodded to his friend, giving him a determined look that spoke volumes. He was going to stand his ground and fight against an entire army if need be. The lives of his family were at stake, and there was no fight Sam wouldn't see to its end for them. Joe gave him a nod, instantly understanding that look and what it meant. He made a fist and tapped it on his heart, letting Sam know he was with him to the end of the line. No words were needed between them, and Sam returned the gesture. Then as one, the two of them erupted from cover and started to fire. Sam dropped 3 of the cartel soldiers as he weaved between cars, sliding into cover as their gunfire converged on them. He looked under the car to see the legs of 8 soldiers advancing on his position. Sam unclipped a grenade from his belt, pulled the pen, and sent it skidding under the car right into their path. "Shit!" one of them yelled out as the grenade exploded, sending them flying back from the point of impact. Sam lay flat and crawled under the car, keeping the writhing forms of those murderers in his sight. Every one of them had the potential to be the man who put a bullet in his wife or son, and for that they all had to die. He carefully aimed from his hiding spot and coldly executed anyone from that group still moving. Another throng was coming, and they seemed to know exactly where he'd gone. Sam cursed as one of them pulled out a grenade and sent it rolling right next to him under the car. Sam rolled back, clearing the vehicle, but he was only a few feet away when the explosion ruptured the fuel tank and blew the entire car into a flaming mess of steel and glass. The explosion knocked Sam back, sending him over the hood of a car in the next lane. He continued with his momentum, rolling off the hood as gunfire followed him. Sam landed hard on the pavement, taking the brunt of the landing with his injured knee. He cried out in pain as a burst of agony engulfed his leg. It was blinding, causing colored spots to appear in his field of vision. His first instinct was to fall back, to grab onto his wounded joint and try to scurry away from danger. But he and Joe were all that was standing between those murderers and his family. He couldn't afford even a moment to focus on his injuries. Gritting his teeth and screaming through the pain, Sam popped up, resting his arms on the hood of the car as he held out his handgun and opened fire. He slammed 3 shots into the chest of a charging cartel soldier and toppled another with a gut shot. He put down another 3 before they started to focus their firepower back toward him. Sam tried to throw himself back in time, but a bullet managed to find his chest on the upper right, just below the collarbone. Thankfully, his body armor absorbed most of the shot, but it still kicked him like a mule, sending the former captain spinning to the ground and gasping for breath. "Sam!" Joe called out. Looking over, Sam saw Joe single-handedly keeping the mob at bay with an automatic rifle, spraying gunfire out in all directions to halt their advance. He ducked and ran toward Sam, crouching beside his friend. "Are you all right?" "Yeah," Sam said, gasping for the breath needed to respond. "I took one to the chest. My vest stopped it, but shit." "All right, tough guy. We need to get away from this," Joe said. "We're not going to win this conventionally." "No," Sam shouted suddenly, grabbing Joe by the shirt and looking at him with hellfire burning in his eyes. "If they lose us, they're going to go after Carolyn and Eric." "Right," Joe said, as if this were obvious to him. "That's why we need to get to them first. We grab them and get the fuck out of here. Lose them together." Sam realized Joe was right. It was their only chance. It would be a tight rescue, and even a tighter escape. But they had to chance it if they had any hope of getting away with all of their lives intact. "All right," Sam said. Joe gave him a smile and a wink, as if he had everything completely under his control. He draped Sam's arm over his shoulder and stood, practically lifting Sam off the ground as he moved with his incredible strength. Bullets flew around them, but Joe turned and returned fire as he ran. The fire was meant to suppress the enemy's advance and was only partially aimed. Thankfully, the glass that covered the door to the building was already shattered, so Joe was able to run inside, dragging Sam until he had enough air in his lungs to move on his own. "I'm good," Sam said to his friend, patting him on the shoulder, which caused Joe to release him. Sam turned, and the 2 of them opened fire on the door, dropping a handful of cartel soldiers attempting to follow them in. "Come on, the stairwell is this way," Sam called out. He and Joe raced into the building, hopefully toward Carolyn and Eric. Chapter 12. "Where are they?" Julio demanded as he walked amidst the shattered glass outside the pharmacy at the base of the apartment building. They ran inside, Jefe, one of the soldiers responded, pointing at the door. Then why the fuck are you assholes out here? Roja bellowed, causing his men to recoil from his fury once more. Get your asses in there and find them. This is your plan? A weathered, scratchy voice called out, carrying above the chaos. Some of Julio's men had already run inside, but the remainder stopped short upon hearing the voice. Julio looked over to see Don Eduardo walking through the devastation, a lit cigar chomped in his teeth. They went inside, Julio responded, pointing toward the doorway. If we don't follow, we're going to lose them. The Don turned and looked at the building, craning his neck all the way up to take it in fully. That's a big building, he said. And you don't know what floor they're on. You don't know what apartment they're looking for. You don't know dick. Tio, I got this under control, Julio said, biting his lip to keep his temper under control. You got shit, the old man said, spitting on the ground between them and belittling his nephew in front of his men. Julio felt his heart beating faster, felt the nearly uncontrollable strain of his rage pound against his ribcage. His fingers instinctively started to curl into a fist, but he stopped them from completing their journey. The old man was sharp and observant. He'd see it, and he'd eventually use it against his nephew in some way down the line. Mind games were his bread and butter. Julio loved his uncle. He was a legend in the industry, and one of the most towering and imposing figures the cartel had ever been fortunate enough to welcome into its ranks. It was an honor to learn from him, to be raised by him, and to inherit all he had to give. But he certainly didn't make the process easy on his nephew. What would you have me do then, Tio? Julio asked, keeping his voice level. The Don was the only person on the planet capable of speaking to him like this, and living to tell the tale. But that didn't mean the tone and content of his uncle's lessons didn't ignite the flames of his furnace heart. Bah, the Don exclaimed, tossing up his hand in a dismissive gesture of contempt. Instead of answering, he walked away from Julio. But the drug lord knew better than to look away. The Don was a brilliant man with a flair for theatrics. It wasn't in his nature to simply walk away when there was a lesson to teach. At the same time, it would never do for him to simply tell Julio what should be done when he could make a scene of it. He stalked over to one of their soldiers and reached out, roughly grabbing something off the man's belt. The soldier stayed perfectly still as the Don took an item from him that Julio couldn't yet see. What he could see, however, was the look of absolute terror on the man's face as the Don approached. Don Eduardo Roja was just as feared as he was respected. He was a ruthless, hard-edged tyrant who suffered no failure, no insolence, and no excuses. Julio knew, had he not been the Don's nephew, he would have found himself on the wrong end of the old man's blade at some point. But family was everything to Eduardo, and he lived for the day when he could fully pass on his seal of approval to his beloved nephew. The old man turned back around and stalked toward Julio with a bottle in his hand. It was a half-empty bottle of tequila, with a dirty white rag sticking out of it, a Molotov cocktail, an alcohol bomb. Eduardo took the cigar from his mouth and tossed it onto the ground. He then pulled a lighter from his pocket and flicked it, bringing the orange flame to life between the two men. Without a word, he held the flame to the cloth, igniting it. Eduardo then moved past Julio, coming up to the sidewalk outside the pharmacy that sat at the base of Shield's apartment building. He heaved the bottle in through one of the many shattered windows, with shocking strength and accuracy for a man of his age. Julio heard the glass shatter and watched in awe as flames spread along the checkout counter within the small store. The Don turned back around, walking away from the scene as the fire spread. He took a fresh cigar out of his pocket, along with a cigar cutter, using it to snip the end. He placed the cigar into his mouth and used the lighter to ignite it as he came face to face with his nephew once more. Julio could smell the familiar aroma of his uncle's favorite cigar brand. It was one of his earliest memories as a boy, and that smell had come to mean many things to him over the years. It meant family, security, and love. But it also carried into his nose feelings of fear, dread, and horror. Eduardo puffed on the cigar, taking it from his mouth to blow a plume of fresh smoke into his nephew's face. "Burn it down," he said, his voice falling to a dangerous whisper. "Watch the exits, the fire escapes, flush them out, and then you get some honor back for this family." The Don pointed at Julio's eye patch with a grimace. He'd always been disgusted by the injury, and he never failed to let his nephew know what a disgrace that was to their family name. Julio looked into the old man's cold eyes. He'd modeled himself after his uncle in many ways, but that predatory look, that ruthlessness, wasn't something one could learn. It wasn't something he'd purposely adopted to posture around like his uncle. It was something he was born with. It was something Julio had inherited from the man through their superior genes. A slow smile started to spread over Julio's lips. He considered himself an apex predator, but this old man still had so much to teach him. He was naturally superior. Behind the frailty of that aging body beat the heart of a tiger. Julio nodded slowly, the metallic grill peeking out from between his parted lips. The old man's expression never changed. He simply continued to look into his nephew's single eye with rock-hard resolve. "Boys," Julio cried out, turning away from his uncle and toward his men. "Light it up!" Chapter 13. Bullets whizzed by Sam's head in the stairwell as cartel soldiers pursued them through the winding tower. "Down!" Joe called out, and Sam instantly ducked, not even giving it a second thought. The moment his head was out of the line of fire, the air above him came alive with a barrage of fire from Joe's rifle, which knocked 2 cartel soldiers off their feet and sent them end over end down the steps, leaving a trail of blood and crunching wet sounds in their wake. "More coming," Sam said, scrambling back to his feet. "Yeah, no shit," Joe responded with a grunt. They could hear the sounds of many soldiers pursuing them. Still, Sam was shocked they hadn't been completely overrun by the forces he'd seen massing outside the building. It was as though only a small fraction of them had followed them inside. Well, that thought should have been an instant relief. It worried Sam more than anything else. What was Roja planning? They were effectively pinned down in the building, but a quick escape could still work. Carolyn's apartment was on the 26th floor, and they'd barely made it up 5. "We need to throw them off," Joe said. "We don't need to lead these fuckers to your doorstep." "Right," Sam replied with a nod. He saw the 5th floor door just ahead and ran toward it, pushing out into the hallway. It smelled vaguely of disinfectant. If not for the darkness, it might have seemed like a typical New York apartment building. A few apartment doors hung open, as if the residents who called this place home had made a run for it the moment explosions started tearing their way through the city. "Here," Sam said, pointing to 2 doorways on opposite sides of the hall. Joe didn't have to ask what he was planning. He simply took the door on the left, while Sam took the door on the right. Pushing the apartment door fully open, Sam saw a disheveled home, not unlike the one Carolyn and Eric had been renting. Some furniture had been overturned, and most of the windows were broken. He crouched in the doorway and drew his rifle, peering out into the hallway. waiting for the stairwell door to open. It didn't take long. 4 cartel soldiers burst into the hallway. Sam held up a hand, letting Joe know he wanted him to hold off and not open fire just yet. "I know they came up here," one of them muttered as they slowly stalked through the hallway. "Door was still open and everything. I don't think this guy is as scary as the boss says." "I don't care about that," another said dismissively. "I want to know where everyone else is. We came running in here and I thought Jefe was going to have the whole squad on our backs." "I saw Hector and his boys coming up behind," the first said. "He should be here soon." "Hector's crew is 6 people, Holmes," the second one responded. "We had a whole lot more than that, still breathing, but these 2 ran in here." "The boss is planning something," another one said. "He's really got a hard-on for this brick." "Of course he does," the first man said, as though this were painfully obvious. "The puta's son took his eye." "Shit, this is the guy who did that?" the last man exclaimed, the shock evident in his voice. "I always thought it was in some huge gang fight or the Don who did it." "Nah," the first man said dismissively. "It was this fucking cop. He stabbed the boss in the eye with a shard of glass after Julio put a bullet in his kneecap." "Shit," the 4th soldier said. "No wonder he's got a chip so far up his ass about this. He put a hold on the entire operation for this. We keep this up and these greaseball Italians are gonna slither out onto our turf." "We took it once, we can take it again," the first man replied. "The boss knows what he's doing, and more than that, the Don knows what he's doing." "True that," the second man replied. "You can tell he's taking this seriously, too. When's the last time you saw that mean old fuck come out in the field for an operation like this?" "Hey," the first man replied. And the sounds of advancing footsteps stopped. It sounded as though there was a sudden struggle, and someone slammed into the wall. "Show some respect, you piece of shit. That man is a fucking legend. And if he ever heard you mention his name like that, he'd do you himself." Right, man, I'm sorry," the second man replied, with panic and genuine remorse in his voice. "Not as sorry as you'd be if the Don or the boss ever heard you talk that way," he growled. And it sounded as though he released the other guy. "Now let's just kill these fuckers and get out of here." Sam's nose wrinkled as a very specific smell wafted in through the broken windows of the apartment. Looking back over at them, he could see the haze of smoke pouring in from outside and rising up in the air from the ground level. "Shit," he thought. Sam popped out from cover and immediately opened fire on the cartel soldiers, who were still composing themselves after that brief confrontation in the hall. Joe followed suit, and their shots tore through all 4 of them before they had a chance to raise their weapons or defend themselves in any way. "Sounds like there's not a lot of coordination going on down there," Joe remarked with a dismissive wave of his hand. "No," Sam replied. "These guys and whoever came up behind him jumped the gun. I think Roja has another plan." "What do you—" Joe started to say before he stopped, sniffing the air. "Smoke?" Sam walked into the apartment, circling around the sofa and tromping over the broken glass that covered the living room floor as he neared the window. He cautiously poked his head out and looked down, nearly gagging on the plumes of black smoke rising up from the base of the building. "Fuck," Sam said, confirming his worst suspicions. "They lit the building on fire. They're trying to smoke us out." "Damn it," Joe spat. "And the fire alarms and smoke detectors all run on electricity, so Carolyn and Eric probably won't even know until the flames spread up." "And by the looks of it, they're spreading fast," Sam said, shaking his head. "We need to double time it. These guys said there were another 6 at least on the way up behind them." He walked out into the hallway and pointed down toward the opposite end. "There's another stairwell over there. Let's take that one." "Right behind you, brother," Joe said, though there was a tightness to his voice that hadn't been there before. "You gonna be all right?" Sam asked, reaching out to put a hand on Joe's shoulder. Yeah, Joe replied, his response clipped and short. Sam could see beads of sweat coming down Joe's temples that likely had nothing to do with the humidity in this hallway. Joe had experienced a lot in Iraq, but one of the worst missions he'd undertaken involved a bomb going off in a civilian building. He'd had to fight his way out through the blaze that had erupted around him and lost a number of his fellow soldiers to the flames. The idea of a building this size fully catching on fire was likely a lot for him to take in. We're going to make it out long before the fire hits us, Sam said, looking hard into Joe's eyes. I know, he replied, trying and failing to show a reassuring smile. Lead the way, brother man. Sam took off down the hallway, hearing the sound of Joe's heavy footfalls behind him. He kicked open the stairwell door and found it was already filling with smoke. Joe followed just a fraction of a second behind him and skidded to a stop as he noted the smoky haze within. Shit, he said, sounding as though he were already out of breath. Move up, Sam said. The sooner we get up there, the sooner we get Carolyn and Eric and get the fuck out of here. As they stood on the threshold of the stairway, the door they'd entered this floor from burst open. Oh, shit, a voice cried out, and Sam turned to see 8 armed men moving into the hallway, stopping short of the men they'd killed. Apparently, they had underestimated the size of Hector's crew. What the hell happened here? Look, one of them said, pointing down the hallway toward them. All 8 of the cartel soldiers charged toward them, and Sam slammed the door shut. He grabbed Joe by the arms. Come on, big man, Sam said. I need you with me now. Yeah, Joe replied, taking a deep, labored breath and nodding, his eyes sharper than daggers as they cut through the smoke and looked up toward their destination. I'm with you. They bounded up the stairs, with their pursuers following a floor or 2 behind. With the building now on fire, Sam knew they had no time to actually stop and duplicate their earlier maneuver. They had to get up these steps, reach Carolyn and Eric, and get out of here before their situation became even more dire. Occasionally, Sam would fire a shot down toward their pursuers, if it sounded like they were getting too close. He needed to keep them far off and hope they were the last of the men who had rushed into the building after them. 26, Joe called out, panting as he pointed ahead at the door for their floor. Sam was winded, and his leg muscles were screaming. His bad knee was throbbing, and his chest ached from the bullet he'd absorbed earlier. To top it all off, his cardiovascular conditioning was proving inadequate for the task, mostly because the deep breaths he was pulling into his lungs were laced with smoke that only continued to thicken as they rose higher and higher into the building. Joe was ahead of him now, and he pulled open the door. The 2 of them dashed into the hallway, sprinting for the door to the apartment. 30 seconds later, they heard the door to the stairwell open, and gunfire rang out around them. Sam felt a shot slam into his armored back that nearly pitched him off his feet. He crashed into the wall and returned fire, not hitting anyone, but still managing to push their pursuers back. Go, Joe called out, pushing past Sam back toward the men chasing after them. He fired with his automatic rifle, scattering them like ants as they dove for what little cover they could find. Sam came to the door of Carolyn's apartment and frantically tried to turn the knob. It was locked. He banged on it several times, but heard no response from within. Joe could only keep their pursuers off for so long. He had to get into the apartment now. Taking a step back, Sam slammed his shoulder into the door, feeling it buck with the force of his impact. He did it again and again, feeling the wooden door give way a little more each time. Finally, he gave one final heave, and the doorframe practically exploded as he burst into the apartment. However, the moment his first boot touched the floor on the other side of the doorway, A shot rang out from within.